ago, President Kirk Schultz signed a proclamation that really, as a WSU, that today is Indigenous Peoples Day, also the city of Pullman. And that day brought a lot of tears to many of us, as Columbus Day is often attached to pain and understanding historical implications to what just that story, the history has done for Indigenous peoples over time. And yet we have so much to celebrate today, our resiliency, just many Indigenous scholars and educators have really paved the trails, as well as just so much incredible tribal work going on in our tribes with just restoration in many different areas. So today we're going to celebrate, and we have the privilege of having Professor Miller join us. And in just a minute, I'll introduce you, but I do want to just take a moment and acknowledge our First Peoples in the land that we all live on. And as a land grant institution, WSU is across Washington State. And so I just want to take a moment and read you our new land acknowledgement that recently, in collaboration with the Provost's office and the President's office, many of you may have read or heard of the recent articles that are entitled Land Grab Universities, and really goes back to talking about the history of our land grant institutions. And part of that history was the Moral Act of 1862, which really are traced back to lands that have been stolen from Indigenous peoples or taken in coercive means. And that's part of our history. We still make money to this day annually, anywhere from, I think around 4.2 million just at last year that we made off Indigenous lands. And so I want to take a minute and acknowledge that we really wrote that statement into our land acknowledgement, because we want to figure out how can we move forward and how can we reconcile the past and really honor Indigenous peoples today. So I'll quickly read that. Washington State University acknowledges that its locations statewide are on the homelands of Native peoples who have lived in this region from time immemorial. Currently, there are 42 tribes, and 35 of which are federally recognized, that share traditional homelands and waterways in what is now Washington State. Some of these are nations and confederacies that represent multiple tribes and bands. The university expresses its deepest respect for and gratitude towards the original and current caretakers of the region. As academic community, we acknowledge our responsibility to establish and maintain relationships with these tribes and Native peoples in support of tribal sovereignty and the inclusion of their voices in teaching, research, and programming. Washington State University established the Office of Tribal Relations and Native American Programs to guide us in our relationship with tribes and service to Native American students and communities. We also pledge that these relationships will consist of mutual trust, respect, and reciprocity. As a land grant institution, we also recognize that the Moral Act of 1862 established land grant institutions by providing each state with public and federal lands, which are traced back to the disposition of Indigenous lands. In 1890, Washington State received 90,081 acres of Indigenous lands designated to establish Washington State University. Washington State University retains the majority of these lands to this day. We acknowledge that the disposition of Indigenous lands was often taken by coercive and violent acts and the disregard of treaties. For that, we extend our deepest apologies. We owe our deepest gratitude to Native peoples of the region and maintain our commitment towards reconciliation. Now I'd like to introduce to you Professor Robert Miller. He will present on Indigenous peoples, international law, and colonialism. He's a professor at Sandro Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State University. He's a citizen of the Eastern Shawnee tribe. He serves as Chief Justice of the Pasco Yaqui tribe, Court of Appeals, and Appellate Court Judge for other tribes as well. He's a William H. Pedrick Distinguished Research Scholar and the Director of the Rosette LLP American Indian Economic Development Program. So we just thank you, Professor Miller, for presenting today and we look forward to learning from you. And please give your attention and welcome. We will do a hand clap here, and I'll turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I'm delighted to join you all from the front room of my house in Portland, Oregon, where I'm teaching because of the virus. Not have to go back to Phoenix this semester. I want to thank Washington State University for inviting me. I want to thank Stephen Martin, Zoe Strong, Joel Berg, and everyone that's involved with putting this together. It's a delight to speak with you. It's very appropriate that we're talking on this subject today. We are talking about the legal, the historic, the cultural, and the religious justifications for the European and Christian domination of North America and the indigenous peoples of North America and around the world. I appreciate very much what Zoe just mentioned about the Morrill Act, which I know only a little bit about. But this is the granting of Indian lands while they were still owned by Indian nations to be used to fund the American land grant colleges. It's quite an outrage when you find out that Cornell University, I'm going by a number that I just barely read in an article a few months ago, but Cornell in New York's received like $9 billion, I think it said, over several hundred years from Indian lands. And this shows how the topic we're talking about, which almost no Americans know anything about, how integral it is to a lot of American history, and even something like the 1862 Morrill Act that created the land grant colleges. So where did America think they could just take these lands from Indian peoples and Indian nations and use them for their own benefit? That's what we're literally talking about, folks. And what I will ultimately talk about, how did the Oregon Territory become part of the United States? How did the United States use this international law of colonialism that today we call the Doctrine of Discovery? So I'm going to share my screen with you. I have quite a PowerPoint presentation. I think you'll still be able to see me in the little thumbnail, but if not, I guess you're looking at the screen. The screen is showing, right? So let's start talking where this subject begins, at least in United States law, folks. Well, clicked on it, didn't work. There it goes. In the United States, folks, and I've been teaching federal Indian law since about 1993, and you begin the topic with this case, Johnson v. McIntosh. You'll see there's no Indian names and no party. There was no tribe. There was no Indian person that was a party to this litigation. These were two white Americans arguing over who owned a piece of land in what's the state of Illinois. And the Supreme Court adopted and looked back at 400 years of European international law to determine what is Indian title. How do Indian nations own their lands? And how could either Mr. Johnson or Mr. McIntosh become the recognized owner under American law of this farmland in what's now Illinois? Now, I want to point out, I don't have time to, we have about 50 minutes to talk. Usually I could talk on this for months. This case arose from land purchases in 1773 and 1775. Now, why do I emphasize that? Because that's before there was a United States. This case literally arose under British colonialism law. And so Johnson v. McIntosh demonstrates to us this is an international law. And in fact, the Doctrine of Discovery, folks, is one of the first international law principles that developed. And this is what we're going to talk about pretty briefly, but how the church in Spain and Portugal developed the international law Doctrine of Discovery, how European Christians could claim rights over all the other peoples of the world. So what did Johnson, I don't have, like I said, I don't have time to tell you the facts of the case and everything that happened, but what does the court hold? It looks back at this 400 years. It literally references Spain and Portugal and England and France's colonizations around the world and church papal bulls from the Vatican, and says that discovery and conquest is how Europeans acquire title over the lands of indigenous peoples. And folks, conquest, you'll probably have to buy my book. I'll make this joke a couple times, but conquest means more than just the act of war. When Columbus came ashore in the Caribbean, when John Cabot sailed along the coast from Newfoundland as far south as Virginia and maybe as far south as Florida, every couple hundred miles he'd row ashore and he'd stick the English flag and the cross in the soil. What was he doing, folks? You've seen those paintings. All these different explorers everywhere they went, in Portugal, in Brazil, where the Portuguese explorers went. The Spanish explorers went throughout Mexico and all of Central and South America. There was always the cross and the flag of their country. They were engaged in a legal procedure, folks, an actual legal procedure to claim those lands and those peoples for their countries. And in Johnson v. McIntosh, the United States Supreme Court, Chief Justice John Marshall, if you know his name, he's certainly the most famous Chief Justice we've ever had. He writes this case and two other Indian law cases. Those three Indian law cases from the early 1800s are still the foundation for federal American Indian law. So this continent was settled on discovery. What happened to the indigenous peoples? This Johnson v. McIntosh case tells us, the moment Europeans showed up with their flag and their cross, indigenous peoples lost some of their rights, some of their ownership rights to land without their knowledge, without their permission, and without being paid a penny. What else did indigenous peoples lose when Europeans showed up? This court says they lost some of their commercial rights and they lost some of their sovereign rights. Now, folks, you may be wondering, why is Miller talking about this 1823 case? That's almost 200 years old now. Folks, this case has been cited by the courts of Canada about 80 times. This case has been cited by the courts of Australia about 50 times. This case has been cited by the courts of New Zealand about 40 times. And in fact, in New Zealand, the highest court of New Zealand cited Johnson v. McIntosh as early as 1847. This case was cited 3 times by English courts, once in regards a Canadian dispute in Canada, two times as regards a dispute in Africa. This case is of enormous international significance, folks, and has applied to indigenous peoples, certainly in the English colonies and elsewhere. So we need to know something about this. And I just want to repeat, as Zoe Strong just said, this case literally led to the United States thinking it could give away Indian lands for the benefit of the land-grant colleges. So it's behind something like the Morrill Act. It's behind the 375 treaties that tribes signed with the United States. Because when the United States came to tribal leaders, to Indian nations, they came with this idea that we're the boss, you're under us, we conquered you, whether it's in real war or just by sticking our flag in the soil. So let's see, when did I really did my work in 2004. I ended up with a book in 2006 on this subject. And while I was reading Johnson v. McIntosh so many times, as a law professor, I thought, what are the elements? What are the factors that make up this larger topic of the doctrine of discovery? Now, if you're not in the law field, crimes are broken down into elements, folks. A tort, if someone runs into your car and you allege they were negligent, there are 4 elements, 4 factors of the tort of negligence that you have to prove in court to win. So I started thinking, well, what are the elements of the doctrine of discovery? Because I wanted to track in American law and history how we borrowed these papal bulls and how Johnson v. McIntosh adopted this international law doctrine into American law. Now, I got to say something, folks, because it just went through my head and I will forget it later. The doctrine of discovery and this planting of flags is still being used today. On August the 7th, 2007, Russia sent a submarine 2.5 miles below the North Pole, and a Russian flag was stuck by a mechanical arm in the soil. You can go online and see that Russian flag. Now, what the heck was that about? They were disputing, and we still are today, who owns the oil and gas under the North Pole. Something like 25% of the Earth's known reserves of oil and gas are under the North Pole, and Russia I mean, you just got to see it. It's unbelievable. They stuck their flag on the bottom of the North Pole. Do you know what China's doing in the South China Sea right now, folks? It's building islands, occupying it, building buildings on these islands they're creating, and sending troops there. And they are claiming this is an inland water of China and no other country in the world can use them. So in essence, China and Russia have brought back, I can't think of a better word, have resurrected this idea of sticking your flag and stuff. And folks, I got to ask you, what's that on the moon? Isn't that the American flag? If we had found oil there, who would we claim, or gold? Those moon rocks we brought home, if they'd have been solid gold, who would have claimed them? How would we build a pipeline to the moon? I don't know. Okay, I digress. I need more time. See, Zoe and Stephen, I need another hour. Okay, let's go through this fairly quickly. I came up with the idea that there are 10 elements that constitute the doctrine of discovery. First discovery. When was the first European in what's now Brazil? When was the first European in what's now Mexico? Second, and Queen Elizabeth I and her lawyers developed this legal principle in the mid-1500s. England didn't care if Spain and Portugal had been somewhere first. England only cared as if Europeans were actually occupying that site when an Englishman showed up. If it was only indigenous peoples, they disregarded that completely. English explorers looked around. If there's no other European explorer there, England claimed it. Now we're going to see this in the Pacific Northwest. We're going to see what the United States did. We're going to see what Lewis and Clark did. And then if you're familiar with Oregon at all, the oldest city in Oregon is Astoria. It's at the mouth of the Columbia River, just across from Washington. And it was built by John Jacob Astor in 1811, the first permanent resident and occupant of the Oregon country, the first European Christian. Let's not forget there were thousands of native peoples here. But the United States was carrying out this second principle, this second element of the doctrine of discovery. Now I'm going to go through these quickly. What title did Europeans acclaim? They claimed the legal ownership of Indian lands. And we're going to see this is part of American law today, folks. Have you heard the phrase trust lands? Most of you, if you know anything about Indian country, you've heard the phrase trust lands. Well, what does that word mean? It means the United States is the legal owner of Indian reservations, and the tribal nation is called the beneficial owner. Not the full-fledged, what we call fee simple absolute owner. The United States is the legal fee simple absolute owner of Indian trust lands. That idea comes from Johnson v. McIntosh. That idea comes from this 600-year-old doctrine of discovery. And this idea right here, preemption. What right did Europeans acquire? And we're going to see Thomas Jefferson use this word in a few minutes. And we're going to see that this word was used in one of the very first United States laws about Indian peoples, July 22, 1790. Our first Congress used the word preemption in describing the rights of Indian lands and who could buy Indian lands. Indian title, what was the tribe left with? Well, it was the right to use and occupy the land. But if the tribe ever moved or if the tribe ever died out, the land now became the United States. I already mentioned Johnson v. McIntosh said tribes lost some of their sovereignty. They lost some of their commercial rights the moment a European showed up with a flag and a cross. Contiguity, what's that fancy word? Well, I'm going to show you a map in a moment, and we will see what defined the boundaries of the Oregon Territory, that includes Washington, and the Louisiana Territory. It was based on discovering the mouth of a river, folks. And once a European explorer stuck their flag and cross at the mouth of a river, that European country claimed the entire drainage system of that river. Now, I brought that up. I'm going to go ahead to my map because I'm taking too long. I shouldn't have done this. See what happens when I go crazy? I've gone crazy. Here's the map, folks. Have you ever, for 1 second, understood what were the boundaries of the Louisiana Territory? 800 million acres, folks. And look at the Oregon country and notice that it runs clear up into modern day British Columbia. We almost went to war with England over the boundaries of the Oregon territory, the Oregon country. Notice on this map, at that time, it was claimed by England, Russia, Spain, and the United States, all based on international law principles, the doctrine of discovery. But look at the boundary. What's the boundary of the Oregon country? It's the drainage system of the Columbia River. Look at the Mississippi, the Louisiana Territory. It's the western drainage system of the Mississippi River, which obviously includes the Missouri. So we'll get to this map in a moment, but this is what defines the expansion of the United States, is the doctrine of discovery and these legal principles, these elements of Johnson v. McIntosh. Okay, here I go. I'm going as fast as my fingers can fly. Terra nullius. It's Latin, empty land. If land is empty, and folks, this is almost finders, keepers, losers, weepers, isn't it? There are property law principles that little kids play with. Possession's 9/10 of the law. Did you know that saying as a little kid? Well, that's number 2, my second element, actual occupancy. But finders, keepers, losers, weepers is sort of terra nullius. If it belongs, if there's no humans living here, when a European showed up, they claimed it. Do you know that for Australia, for almost 180 years, England claimed Australia based on the legal principle of terra nullius? They looked around and saw thousands and thousands and maybe millions of Aboriginal peoples, but they said the land is empty and so we claim it for the crown. In 1990, the Australia Supreme Court decided the Mabo case and said that was a lie then, it's a lie now, and our court system cannot perpetuate a lie. And they struck down the terra nullius principle for land ownership in Australia. And the Australian Parliament has been struggling with what to do ever since 1992. Okay, conquest. War obviously gives rights to the conqueror, but I've already told you that I believe, and I argue in my book, that when Europeans arrived just with the flag and the cross, it was as if they had just won a war against the indigenous peoples and nations because they claimed all these rights we're talking about. I don't need to explain these to you. Christianity has always been used as a bludgeon, as a tool in the claims of European Christians to have superior rights to the rest of the world. You all, if you've studied anything about American Indian policy, you know that civilization and us uncivilized savages, that's always been as an excuse for the superior European culture and civilization to take over. So remember these 10 elements, folks, because majority of my book is then tracing how these elements were used in United States law and United States history to claim the entire continent of now the United States for the United States. And again, I go back to what Ms. Strong said at the start. The Morrill Act is based on this idea that the United States was the superior owner of these lands and could grant them to the land grant colleges even before they had been taken or purchased from the Indian nations. Now, I want you to remember that because we're going to see that in the Oregon Territory. The United States was giving away land to Americans before it had even bought the land from tribes and Indian nations. It's, kind of outrageous. Okay, let's start here. Some people point to the Crusades as the beginning of the doctrine of discovery, folks. 1096 is when the first crusade began, and it went through something like 1277, with European Christians attacking the Holy Lands, the Middle East, trying to take them back. But most people look to the papal bulls of the early 1400s, to the development of the fact that Spain and Portugal had superior rights authorized by God as authorized by the earthly representative of God, the Pope. In 1436, you get the first papal bull granting the Canary Islands. If you know, the Canary Islands are out in the ocean off of the Iberian Peninsula, off Portugal and Spain. And at first, the Pope resisted the King of Portugal's claim to want those lands. And then the King of Portugal gave the best argument in the world. He told the Pope, if you will give me these lands, I'll convert these people to Catholicism. What Pope could say no to that? So you get the papal bull of 1436. As Portugal continued its explorations to the south around Africa, they then turned to the Pope for more papal bulls. And from 1452 to 1455, Pope Nicholas V issued Portugal these papal bulls. If you've never heard the phrase, folks, a papal bull is an edict of the church, an order from the Pope. And if you know how important the Pope was at those times, an earthly king could not be excommunicated. That'd be the end of them. So they had to listen to what the Pope said. Look what I've underlined here. Look what the Pope authorized Portugal to do in Africa. Invade, steal, fight. The word Saracen means Muslim, folks. Attack Muslims and pagans, take their properties, their kingdoms, their goods, reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and convert all of these things to the King of Portugal's benefit. This, looks like a declaration of war, doesn't it? But it's certainly a declaration, I guess, from God herself for Portugal to take over all of Africa. So when Columbus heads west, folks, what were you taught in school? It's disgusting what we learn in school and don't really learn the truth. I know we all think that Columbus was headed west to try to find cinnamon and pepper and cayenne. Okay, folks, Columbus signed 7 contracts with the King and Queen of Spain before they would fund his sailing west. Spices are mentioned in the 7th document. What's in the other and more important documents is that Columbus was looking for land to claim for Spain. Did you notice Spain had been left out of all these other papal bulls? These were all for Portugal. And so Spain and Columbus says, I think I can find land going west. And they authorized, in fact, I can quote you the line. They said, quote, we will make you the admiral over any lands you acquire for us, period, close quote. That is the real purpose of the expeditions that Columbus went west. So you can imagine the moment he did find some lands, he rushed back to Spain. Spain sent their lawyers to the Pope, the new Pope, Alexander VI, give us a papal bull now. And there were 4 papal bulls issued about Spanish conquests and acquisitions in the New World. Here's the main one, May of 1493. Notice the elements, my elements of the Doctrine of Discovery. The Pope granted to Spain any lands that had been undiscovered by others that were not previously possessed by another Christian owner. That's element 1 and 2 of my breakdown of Johnson v. McIntosh and the Doctrine of Discovery. A few months later, the Pope issues another papal bull. Folks, look at the ignorance of what we were taught in school. Was Columbus afraid he was going to sail off the edge of the world? Wait a minute, he said there's lands out there and I'm confined them for you. And then the Pope draws a line from the North Pole to the South Pole. So they knew about the poles even. And I'm going to show you a map in a moment. This line is quite significant in world history, folks. But look again, the Doctrine of Discovery, granting Spain these lands under the authority of God. So there's the religious aspect. And to do what? To expand the Christian rule. So again, is this in essence a declaration of war? Here's the line that Pope Alexander VI drew, folks. It's the dotted red line. Portugal refused to accept that line and demanded it be moved about 500 miles to the west, which it was. And you see in the left side of that map, the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, the year later, Spain and Portugal agreed to move that line further west. This is how Portugal ends up with Brazil. You all know they speak Portuguese in Brazil. It was a Brazilian colony. Spain and Portugal fought over the lands down there for, 100 years or more. At the time, no one knew about the rest of the world. What was Magellan in 1521, Magellan sailed around the world, the first time a European had circumnavigated the globe. Now we knew there was a whole rest of the world. And so look to the right-hand bottom of that. In the Treaty of Zaragoza, another city in Spain, Spain and Portugal agreed to draw the dotted line, the line of demarcation through the Pacific. Notice Australia is cut in half, folks. In 1770, I'm forgetting these dates. In 1770, when James Cook landed near Sydney and went ashore to plant the British flag and cross, England was only claiming the eastern half of Australia because they knew about this line of demarcation and were slightly honoring it. And it wasn't for several decades, 70 years before England began to claim all of Australia. Okay, I digress, but how, so these are papal bulls. Spain and Portugal's decision to divide the world for them and them alone. Now I'm gonna go through this pretty quickly because I see how fast time can go. How did England end up in the New World? Where'd the 13 original colonies of the United States come from? English discoveries, orders under these kings. Henry VII told John Cabot to go, and I want you to hear my elements of the Doctrine of Discovery. King Henry VII ordered his discoverer, John Cabot, to go where no earthly prince has yet been and acquire for me sovereignty, jurisdiction, and title. So when John Cabot was sailing from Newfoundland down to maybe as far as Florida and planting the flag occasionally, he was making these claims to ownership, to empire, to colonies for the King of Spain, of England. Elizabeth I mentioned, she developed this second principle of my Doctrine of Discovery. And then when James I charters Jamestown in 1606, and then when he writes the charter for New England, which is where the Mayflower and the Pilgrims landed in 1620, the Doctrine of Discovery is all over these documents. Folks, in the charter of 1620 that James I issued, there are 9 of my 10 elements of the Doctrine of Discovery stated in that document. You ought to go online and read it. So what was my point? And I got to show you this because this it's not so much the Doctrine of Discovery, but if you've never read this letter by George Washington, it'll take your breath away, I think. So here's how the United States was founded. We're mostly considered an Anglo-American country. Yes, the Spanish were in many states in the southeastern and southwestern part of the United States, and the French were here for a while in the Mississippi Valley, mostly in Canada. St. Louis, St. Genevieve, New Orleans, those were French established towns. They all operated under this international law principle that they owned it because they apparently or allegedly found it first. But let me show you this very significant letter that General George Washington wrote to the Congress. This was before our Constitution was ratified, folks. This was under what we call the Articles of Confederation Congress. George was advising them how to deal with the tribes and how to grow the United States. I have things in my way. I can't really read this too well. You can read, I can't see it. You can read this faster than me, but he said, as we advance to the West, we're going to encounter Indian nations. I think this, I cannot see this, but he says something like settlement of the West is so tied up with native peoples. Well, there I can see it. There can be no definition of the one without involving the other. Now he said, how do we get the lands of Indian peoples? I'll let you read that. He says we should purchase their lands instead of fighting wars with them. And then he compares Indians to animals. This is known as the savage's wolf letter because he compared the savages, us Indians, to animals. And he says, I've underlined it. Look what he says. We've learned as we advance our frontiers, the wild animals, the wild beasts retreat, they disappear. And he said, we'll do the same thing with the savage as the wolf, Indians, Indian nations, and it will require them to retire. And then look what he says, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. I looked up the word prey again this morning just to be certain I knew what it meant. It means to be hunted like animals. I'll let you read that. I don't know, does it shock you as much as it does me? But there's the father of our country, and that's the advice he gave to Congress, how to deal with Indian nations. Okay, I'm going to go pretty quick through some of this. I see it's already 12 minutes to 1. President Thomas Jefferson plays a big role in my book, 2 chapters, because he was a lawyer. He had practiced law for 7 years full-time before he got into politics. He knew everything about the doctrine of discovery and how Virginia, the colony of Virginia before that, and how England had claimed native lands. Somebody literally wrote a book analyzing all the cases that Thomas Jefferson handled while he was a lawyer in Virginia. Half of his cases were land title disputes. He knew how England, then the colony of Virginia, the state of Virginia, and Virginians had acquired Indian lands. And he uses the right of preemption, which I mentioned to you earlier. It was my 3rd element of the doctrine of discovery. In 1792, Jefferson was our Secretary of State. He was in serious negotiations with the English foreign minister about the rights of England and the United States in North America. He was arguing with England, you have to leave our territory, England. You can't deal with our Indians. He literally used that phrase. He said, those are our Indians, and you can't trade with them. You can't sign treaties with them. We have the right of preemption over them. So that's exactly what Thomas Jefferson was thinking. In these same meetings, he also used my other element of the doctrine of discovery. I already mentioned them slightly. He told the English foreign minister, the Hudson's Bay Company has got to stop trading with our Indians. You do not have that right under international law. This was while Jefferson was the Secretary of State in George Washington's cabinet. Once he was president, Thomas Jefferson recognized plainly the relationship between the United States, between Indian nations, and that the Indian nations still owned property rights in their lands. They just were not the fee simple absolute owners. The U.S. was delighted to buy from the Indian nations. The 8 years that President Jefferson was the president, he signed 26 treaties with Indian tribes, always buying land, always moving the tribes. In 1804, folks, just after making the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, Jefferson wrote a 40-page pamphlet trying to guess how large Louisiana was and discussing the whole topic of it. What were France's rights in the Louisiana Territory? Well, it was the doctrine of discovery and that element that I told you of contiguity. So Jefferson tried to guess how big Louisiana was based on France finding the mouth of the river when they established New Orleans. You know that the United States sent 4 expeditions. All of us know the Lewis and Clark expedition, but the United States sent other expeditions trying to determine the western drainage system of the Mississippi River to find out how big it was. And that's how we ended up with the Louisiana Territory. Even after we made the Louisiana Purchase, this is a quote from a sentence that Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to Meriwether Lewis giving him instructions for the Lewis and Clark expedition. He wrote Meriwether Lewis a letter and said, hey, we just bought all this land from France. We purchased the Louisiana Territory. You are no longer crossing territory that might belong to Spain or might belong to France. It belongs to us, the US. But look what he said, it's still subject to the Indian rights of occupancy. So as a good lawyer, Jefferson knew all about the doctrine of discovery, the European claims to own lands, and he knew all this long before the Supreme Court decided Johnson v. McIntosh. Okay, I want to move faster because there's lots more to talk about. This talk's not about Lewis and Clark. I want to get to the Northwest, but Lewis and Clark created America's legal claim to the Oregon Territory over the indigenous peoples, ignoring that the indigenous peoples and nations that were already there. I'm literally going to skip this stuff. We already looked at the map. Let's get to here. How did the United States claim the Pacific Northwest, the Oregon country? If you don't know that phrase, the Oregon country encompassed most of what's now Oregon, all of what's now Washington, all of what's now Idaho, a little bit of Montana, and a little bit even of Wyoming, and all of British Columbia, or a lot of British Columbia. How did the United States make this legal claim? Because we claim we found it first. In May of 1792, so Doctrine of Discovery, folks, in May of 1792, an American sea captain sails a few miles up the Columbia River. He names the river after his boat. Apparently, this river had not been discovered by Europeans before this. So his boat's named the Columbia Rediviva. He names it after himself. What does Thomas Jefferson do immediately? At least in those days, that's pretty immediately. He sends Lewis and Clark to the mouth of the Columbia River. That is exactly where he ordered Lewis and Clark to go. He knows the principle of contiguity. He knows what made the shape of the Louisiana Territory, the drainage system of the Mississippi. So now he wants this American claim to the entire Columbia River. And I think I already mentioned this, the first permanent European/American settlement in the Oregon Territory was the town of Astoria that an American fur trader made in 1811. Indian rights, ignored. Indian peoples, ignored. I'm going to cover this very quickly. This is one of the chapters in my book. I argue that American manifest destiny comes directly from the doctrine of discovery. This is not my definition of manifest destiny. This is what American historians have agreed manifest destiny means. And if you can't see the doctrine of discovery and my 10 elements in that definition, then you're going to have to watch the talk over again if we can put this online. So now, what happened here? What happened where we are all at, like right now? Remember, Spain and Russia claimed this area too, because their explorers had been through here. They had stuck the flag in the soil at different times. Russia was pretty smart, folks. They buried brass plates. More than 30 of them. Only one's ever been found. It was up in Alaska near Sitka. And you can still see this Russian plate claiming the land. That just like that flag and cross, you can see it in a museum in Sitka. So the United States signed treaties with Spain and Russia in these years, and we bought them off and we got rid of them. And so only England and the United States were still claiming the Pacific Northwest. We both were arguing the doctrine of discovery. I have read the letters between our secretaries of state and the English home ministers arguing who found it first, who lived here first, did James Cook sail through here in 1778, when did Lewis and Clark get here, etc. We signed treaties with England to jointly share the territory in 1818 and 1827. And then in 1844, folks, do you remember one of the more famous campaign slogans in history? 54, 40, or fight. Now today, none of us hardly know what that means. Obviously, when James Polk ran for the presidency, everyone knew what it meant. So let me just take you, where did that map go? 5440, folks, means the 54th degree of parallel, which is way off the top of my map here. So James K. Polk was running for office claiming war with England if we did not get clear up to the 54th degree of parallel. That's the southern tip of Alaska to this day, folks. So James K. Polk was using the doctrine of discovery, using these American doctrine of discovery claims to the Pacific Northwest to claim the whole area, or he was going to go to war. Well, obviously we did not go to war with England, and in 1848, we drew the line. We signed another treaty with England, and we drew the line at the 49th degree of parallel, where it is still to this day, the very northern border of Washington. What happens? We then get the Oregon Territory. Congress immediately creates the area as a territory. Here's the act I mentioned earlier that kind of ties in with what Ms. Strong was talking about with the Morrill Act. Even before signing a single treaty with any of the Indian nations in the Oregon Territory, folks, which includes Idaho, Washington, the United States started giving land away to American settlers. An American settler who settled on 320 acres of land, lived there for 5 years and improved it, the United States would give them the legal title. And yet the United States didn't even have the title from the tribal nations yet. In fact, my next slide, finally, the United States started signing treaties with tribes. These early treaties in 1850 were never ratified by Congress. So the Indian nations were literally just cheated. They thought they had signed an agreement, were going to be paid X money, certain things were going to be given them, and they would orderly move to a particular spot. Congress never ratified it. You folks are in Eastern Washington, you're no doubt within territory, most of you are in Eastern Washington, you're no doubt within territory that the Yakima Nation and other tribes, the Spokane tribe, maybe Colville, ceded to the United States through treaties that were signed primarily in 1855. Congress ratified these treaties finally in 1859, and the tribes were allegedly paid. But what was going on? The United States was exercising its power under the doctrine of discovery to be the only purchaser of Indian lands. Now, I didn't emphasize this too much earlier, but what does the word preemption mean? Remember, that was my third element of the doctrine of discovery. Remember, Thomas Jefferson used that word when he was talking to the British ambassador in 1792. Remember, Congress put that word in one of the very first Indian laws it enacted July 22, 1790. The United States preempts, because it has the power of the doctrine of discovery, these rights under international law. The United States is the only possible purchaser of Indian lands, trust lands. If a tribe wanted to sell its reservation, it has to sell it only to the United States or get the permission of the United States. Folks, maybe you've heard that Indian peoples that own trust land on reservations can't get a bank mortgage. Well, that's because the United States is the legal owner, and banks cannot get a mortgage on land owned by the United States. So this doctrine of discovery and the legal regime that has come from 600 years of papal bulls have led to today when Indian people can't hardly get a mortgage to build a house on their own land on a reservation if it's trust land. So, I mean, this can be pretty complicated. You're going to have to take my whole 15-week class to learn all of this. But tie this into something as crazy as somebody showing up with a flag and a cross at your house and claiming your property. So about now, if this was a talk in person, I'd pick someone in the front row and I'd tell them I'm going to come over to your house tonight with the Bob Miller flag and the Bob Miller religious symbol, and I'm going to claim your house. And what would you do? Let's see, what's the number? 911, right? Or else go get your gun and shoot this idiot that's out in the front yard. But this is the doctrine of discovery, folks. This is what was going on. Oh, here's my 2 books, but I'm almost at an end, but let's talk a little more. And I don't know if there's any questions that we do. I think, Zoe, you mentioned we'd look those at the end perhaps, but I have a few more comments. So what are the effects? What is being done? What can we do about it? What's the benefit of listening to this talk and understanding Johnson v. McIntosh? Well, folks, it gives you so much more insight into American history and American Indian law that the light bulb should just practically turn on in your head. So now, Zoe, you mentioned the Morrill Act. Well, now we know why Congress thought it could just give away Indian lands to the land-grant colleges, because they assumed it was their land and they were the superior owner. Someday the Indians are going to die out, and then the United States will have what we would call the complete title. The right to buy it is now merged with the Indian right to use and occupy it. Under Anglo-American property law, folks, that is the complete title. And now the United States thinks it can give it away, sell it, do whatever it wants. Let me take you back. This thought just went through my mind. The United States has mostly funded itself through a lot of history by selling Indian lands, folks. Thomas Jefferson joked in his private diary that he was buying, remember I said that while he was president, he signed 26 treaties with different tribes. He joked that he paid 5 cents an acre and was selling the same land for $1.50 an acre to American settlers. He joked in his diary that he had balanced the federal budget on the sale of Indian lands. So when we talk about the theft of Indian lands, Oh, most of the time it was done by a treaty. The United States could point at a legal document or some kind of an agreement, but that still does not erase that it was theft. It was genocide. It was ethnic cleansing on a major scale. My own tribe was removed from Ohio in 1832 to our current lands in northeast Oklahoma. That's where my mom was born. Plainly ethnic cleansing. Dozens of other tribes, the 5 civilized nations, they're called, from the southeast of the US, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creek, Seminoles, and Choctaws were all forcibly removed in the 1830s. That's ethnic cleansing. So what is it? What can we do? So some people have literally been approaching the Vatican for several decades to try to withdraw some of those papal bulls we were talking about. In 2010, the Vatican said, hey, those papal bulls don't mean anything anymore. We withdrew them in something like 1538 when we issued another papal bull that said Indians in the New World were human beings. I think in a nutshell, that is the Vatican's argument. Many people say, in fact, today, folks, there's a group from Hawaii, I think, that are doing symbolic burnings of the papal bulls. And I think they do this every year. So there's plenty of focus on the origination of this international law principle as a church doctrine, as a doctrine of empire, primarily for Spain and Portugal. But I have to tell you that if the Catholic Church were to say tomorrow, absolutely repudiate those papal bulls, it would be a fabulous moment of educational moment of world history, and maybe open the eyes of millions of people who've never even heard the doctrine of discovery. But I don't see how that could change the law in the United States tomorrow. That would not reverse Johnson v. McIntosh. That would not somehow convert trust lands into lands owned only by tribal nations. So in my first book there on the screen, I have a pretty modest proposal about how we deal here in the United States with issues of the doctrine of discovery. Worldwide, folks, indigenous peoples are faced with challenges of not even being recognized. The UN fought for more than a decade whether to use the word indigenous people or indigenous peoples. They literally fought for a decade whether to use that S. So the recognition in other countries that Indian peoples are nations, political bodies, political cultures that deserve recognition as governments, that's the big issue in most of the countries around the world. In Canada, here in the United States, tribes at least are recognized as having sovereign powers and being able to govern their lands and their peoples. So there's a big challenge around the world, what to do. The United Nations itself has taken up this issue in what's called the DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2007, the General Assembly of the UN overwhelmingly adopted it. The vote, folks, in fact, was 146 nations voted yes, 4 nations voted no, and 11 nations abstained. Who do you think the 4 no votes were, folks? Surely it was that evil empire of Russia, Iran, China, right? No, folks. The 4 no votes were I slandered England, were the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Now that might surprise you a little bit, but since that time, those 4 nations have all decided to comply with the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, although Canada and the United States put a qualifier on it. In fact, it's President Obama who issued this proclamation, I believe in 2009, that the United States would comply with the DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, as long as it complies with American law. So in other words, the DRIP apparently means nothing in the United States than what wasn't already law. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues holds an annual meeting of about 11 days. And in May of 2012, they addressed the doctrine of discovery. So there is some movement on the issue, but what can we do about it? And that is the struggle. Will the Supreme Court ever reverse Johnson v. McIntosh, like Australia reversed in 1990 in the Mabo case? Australia reversed the principle of terra nullius. So maybe there's some hope that some court case someday, the court will look at Johnson v. McIntosh and say that this doctrine of discovery is based on a racial, ethnic, religious falsehood, and we should not perpetuate that. I'll tell you, just as Australia has been struggling with how to handle the Mabo case and what has resulted, the United States would have a big struggle dealing with the fallout of the doctrine of discovery. So I may be leaving you without some perfect answer. I don't have a perfect answer. How do you solve and address a legal historical issue that is 600 years old and that has been part of United States law and American law? The English arrived here, and the French and the Spanish arrived here, and the Dutch and the Swedish and the Russians when they arrived here 400 years or so ago. But that's where we are, folks. That's what the doctrine of discovery means. Its relevance to this day. It's not just some funny old historical fact that we can sit back and chuckle about. In Indian country today, the doctrine of discovery is alive and well and still affects Indian nations, Indian peoples, their sovereign rights, their property rights, and their human rights. Thank you very much for attending the talk.
Thank you so much, Professor Miller, for your words, your knowledge, bringing that education to our audience, and helping us honor Indigenous Peoples Day in the way it needs to be honored, and giving us an awareness of the criminal history of this country, and giving us an understanding that there is more than one villain in this situation other than Columbus. So we thank you for those words. I know that you agreed to stick around a little bit and answer some questions from our audience members. I do want to thank our audience for those who showed up to listen to Professor Miller today. And I do believe that Joel is fielding the questions right now. So I'm going to give it over to Joel to share those questions with you, Professor Miller. Okay?
Thank you. Sure.
All right. Joel?
All right. So they're all in the chat. So the first one comes from Rachel, and they ask, do you think the hashtag land back movement will be able to obtain any legal resources in the near future? And then how can we best support Indigenous rights movements if there's no legal recourse under the laws of the U.S. government?
I didn't quite understand the hashback of, or what'd you say, of land back? I'm not familiar with what that is, so I can't address that. Supporting Indian peoples and Indian causes is a political issue, right? So one does that by writing letters. One does that by financially supporting Indian organizations. The National Congress of American Indians is probably the best known national organization. About 170 tribes are members of NCAI. That's what it's called, National Congress of American Indians. I would encourage anyone to go on their webpage, see the kind of things they advocate for. Their headquarters are in DC. They literally bought a building on Ambassador's Row to make a very powerful political point. NCAI is in Washington, DC because that's, of course, the center of American government, but that's where ambassadors go to try to influence the United States government. And that's why the NCAI is located in DC. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians. Check them out online, see what kind of work they do. Find out what the local tribes are, what their issues are. And if you can support such a thing, then do that. Tribes are interested in so many issues, economic issues, environmental issues, the things you and I are worried about every single day. Indian Child Welfare Act is being challenged in the courts right now. If you know anything about the Indian Child Welfare Act, the Trump administration, I shouldn't have said that, several state attorney generals have brought lawsuits to try to destroy the Indian Child Welfare Act that was enacted in 1978, the same as they're trying to litigate against the Affordable Care Act. And this case is hanging in the balance in the Fifth Circuit. Probably will go to the US Supreme Court maybe next year. There are tons of issues. No matter what you're interested in, Indian peoples, Indian nations have an analogous need and desire, and you could be involved in your local areas. Here's what I just thought of. Washington State's one of the few states that passed a law that requires your local schools, it's one of the few states that have done this, to teach the law and history of the local tribes. I think that curriculum's just being rolled out. Oregon now has a curriculum similar to that's going to be rolled out soon. So these are just some of the things you can support. Do not forget indigenous peoples and whose lands these are, and that these indigenous peoples are still here. That's what America wants to think. They want to think all Indians are gone, and this blight on American history, we can just forget it now. That's not true. The poorest people in the United States are American Indians. The sickest people in the United States are American Indians. The least educated people in the United States are American Indians. We are at the lowest indicator of any factor you want to use. So anyway, I got pretty passionate, and that took a long answer, didn't it? Sorry, Joe.
No, that's okay. Okay. The next question comes from Austin, and they said they're curious about possible legal/institutional approaches for addressing the inability to get mortgages on tribal lands. And then they said, like, would a federal bank or tribal bank be able to do this?
Well, that last one's very interesting. Very few tribes own their own banks. My tribe owns its bank. I believe there's not more than 14 tribes that own a bank. So that's whoever asked that question, you said, Austin, I think that's a clever idea. Congress has attempted to address the issue of the absence of mortgages in Indian country. There are a couple programs where the federal government guarantees the loan 100% if the bank will issue it. Many thousands of Indians have used those two programs. One's through the Department of Agriculture. It's called the 248 program. The other one, I'm probably through Department of Interior. It's called Section 184. So these loans are available to Indian peoples, and the federal government guarantees the loan. So there are movements afoot to try to address some of these problems of the status of trust land and how to use it. Now, I want to say one more thing about trust lands, folks. Tribes own 56 million acres of land in the lower 48 states in trust status. That means the United States is the real legal owner. The tribe's the beneficial owner. The tribe cannot sell, the tribe cannot lease, the tribe cannot develop that land without the permission of the Secretary of Interior. In the lower 48 states, there are 11 million acres of trust land owned by individual Indians. That individual Indian cannot sell that land, cannot lease that land, cannot really develop that land without the permission of the Secretary of Interior. Citation to authority, if you were in my law class, I would be asking you citation to authority, counselor. Well, Johnson v. McIntosh, Papal Bulls. And that first law I've referenced a couple times, folks, from July 22, 1790, that law is still on the books today. Today we call it 25 USC section 177. The word preemption is not in the statute anymore, but it is 95% the same statute that first Congress enacted in 1790. So the doctrine of discovery is so tangled up in American Indian law. That's what I meant earlier. It would be hard to pull it away and would take a long time, a lot of great thought, and blue ribbon commissions and tribal involvement to change what is such a basic factor in American Indian law. Okay, Joelle, next one, please.
All right, this one's from Don. And so Genesis 1:28 is one key chapter verse used within the Doctrine of Discovery. Is there any other Bible chapters or verses used that you are aware of?
Is that Don Motanic? Good question, Don. Genesis 1:28 was our founding fathers' favorite scripture. Now, I don't know if you knew that, Don, or why you brought that up, but isn't that the phrase that ordered Adam and Eve to multiply and subdue the earth? And so part of Anglo-American, Euro-American culture was that you have to dominate, destroy, I don't know if that's the right word, but dominate the environment. early Americans were afraid of the wilderness. Are we still afraid of the wilderness today? But for most indigenous peoples, that's where they lived. They weren't afraid of the wilderness. But the Genesis 1:28. So you asked if there were any other scriptures. I guess I don't know scriptures well enough, but I have read many historians write that Genesis 1:28 was the founding fathers' favorite scripture. So interesting you mentioned that, Don. Next question, please.
All right. Nicholas asked, students interested, oh, maybe this is a question, I should read it first. Oh, just kidding. He's giving some advice to students. And a question that we have is from Nicole. Where can you find the quote you referenced from Thomas Jefferson's personal journals about the sale of Indian land to balance the budget?
What I wrote this long enough ago, folks, that I did not have much help from the internet. There's a 20-volume set from like 1904 called The Writings of Thomas Jefferson. I had to thumb through those manually. Now you can word search them online. So whoever asked that question, I wish I was writing my book now. Dang, was that a lot of work. It's called The Writings of Thomas Jefferson. You can find it, you can word search it, and its entire 20-volume set. Now, whether his diary was in that volume, I don't know where I found that. There's a couple other books about Lewis and Clark. There's an entire book by Don Jackson of just the letters of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And so my quote from January of 1804, where Jefferson was writing a letter to Meriwether Lewis, that's in that book edited by Donald Jackson. Where his diary was and where I found it, we're talking 16 years ago now. Yikes. You could probably find it online now, right? Type it into, what's that thing called? Google? Next question, please, Joelle.
All right. We have a question from Arena. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And they're asking, where did the native people come from or originate, and how did they end up on these lands currently known as the U.S.?
Excellent question. The best known Indian intellectual is Vine Deloria Jr. He passed away about, I don't know, 5-6 years ago. He wrote some of the most important books in Indian intellectualism. He was executive director of the National Congress of American Indians, I think in 69, 71. So I mentioned that organization earlier, how central that is. Vine Deloria disputes the Bering Land Strait theory. And whoever asked the question, most native people say we were created here. The Navajo Nation, the Navajo people, folks, they have their 4 sacred mountains. That's their territory. That's their land. They say they were created there. So I have no answer for you. The Bering Strait theory, I don't know how many scientists still believe in it. Radiocarbon dating now shows that humans were here in the United States, Indian humans, Indian cultures were here thousands of years earlier than originally was said and assumed as being an Asiatic migration across the Bering Land Strait. So I have no expertise on this. I'm just, you gave me a microphone, I'm going to talk for a little bit, but I have no expertise on that. Joelle?
Thank you. I think that was the last question in the chat, but and if anyone has any other ones, quickly put it in there. Otherwise, I think that's all of them.
Oh, look at that. Somebody just posted in the chat how you can get my book from the library. No, wait a minute. Buy my book. Come on, folks. Oh, look at that. Someone's holding it up. That's the paperback edition of my book 1. I want you guys to see this. This is the second book I wrote, and I mostly want you to see the cover. So I co-wrote this with 3 professors that are indigenous, Canadian professor Tracy Lindbergh, Australian professor Larissa Barrett, and a Maori professor from New Zealand named Jacinta Ruru. And we were gifted this painting, and look how appropriate it is for today, folks. Take a look. There's the cross impaled in this native, I hope you can see that. And look at those 3 ships there. I wonder whose 3 ships those might be. But this book, if you want to see how the Doctrine of Discovery, and we used my 10 elements, So I think I wrote 3 chapters, other people wrote 2, and Jacinta wrote 3 chapters. But we write about how the doctrine of discovery was applied in all 4 English colonies. And also I'm researching right now how Europeans use the doctrine of discovery to divide up Africa. And you can get articles of mine that are free online about how Portugal used the doctrine in Brazil and how Spain used the doctrine in Chile. I'm primarily focused on Chile, but it's the same thing Spain did from the southwest and southeast of the US all the way to Tierra del Fuego. So thank you. Okay, if I've worn
Thank
you guys out, then I should be worn out too, right?
I'm not wore out at all. I could actually sit here for another couple hours and would love to ask more questions. I will invite you back, and hopefully we can have a deeper dive and discussion. But what a privilege it was. Thank you for just walking us through history in a passionate way, because history is so important for us to understand. And it's probably some of the most misinformation that's out there in the history books. And I appreciate the work of Washington and Oregon and different folks like you that are diving deep to kind of provide more of an accurate version and history or a picture of what history is and the impact that it still impacts us today. So I just want to close with saying, you know, we are as a university looking at the Morrill Act and really considering what is our obligations. Once you have information, what do you do with it? And it's really important not just to walk away and ignore it. And so we're going to really wrestle with that with the commissioning folks from tribal communities and working with university folks to talk about what is our obligation. So thank you for just providing that history, which kind of led up to that act. And that we're benefiting from it today, still in indigenous lands, and we're privileged to be able to get education and to learn. And I just want to really, as we go about today and celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day, to think about often our privileges are at the cost of someone else, and it's very humbling. And so I just thank you. I thank you, all the participants, and we'll invite you back and we'll let people know and we'll have further and deeper discussions. So thank you, and everyone have a wonderful day. We have another activity at 4 o'clock. Joelle, do you want to provide details?
Yeah, at 4 p.m. today, we have artist Stephen Paul Judd joining us again over Zoom. Those links are on our webpage if you're interested in joining us then as well. And if you need questions or you can't get on later, I did put my email in the chat, so feel free to just reach out and I will get those questions answered for you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. This has been a great blast.
Have a wonderful day. Thank you.